lot of these grass fires, wildland fires, you can't really set up your tactics ahead of time until you see wind conditions, the actual terrain.
Yes, there's topography, there's fuel moisture, there's a lot of other influences, but wind will override all.
The fire is moving in this direction, and it's moving at this rate of spread. And so what I need to be thinking about is where am I going to put my resources that are going to be able to stop its advancement?
Hello, I'm Justin Shore from First Responders Network TV, and you're watching Seat at the Table. Today we have Jeff Zolfarelli from the Livermore Pleasanton Fire Department. And I'm also joined by Todd McNeil from the City of Sonora Fire Department. Thank you for taking time out of your schedules and pulling up a chair and having a seat at the table. We'd like to break from our usual EMS content, really dive into some firefighting topics for our audience. As you know, we have an audience made up of EMS, first responders, EMTs, paramedics, firefighters, and also police officers. What I want to talk about today is your area of expertise, wildland firefighting, and really start talking about the initial response that a firefighter, volunteer firefighter, engineer, and first company officer has to deal with in a wildland situation. Jeff, in your experience, if you can maybe just tell our audience how you got started and maybe one of your first wildland response memories.
Well, interesting, my career started out in law enforcement and went into the fire service. And I can remember working for a city that had a very small amount of interface and even grass fire activity, getting those opportunities to go out and deal with those grass fires, being normally structural firefighter off. So you get in that mode of, well, we put the hose down and we go up to the front door and you do some normal things that make the structure firefighter active. When you get into the wildland scenario, the dynamics are so much different because you're out in the open. It's not a confined space. It's not restricted to just a room and contents or just a building. And so we get out and it's kind of, initially it's pretty impressive because you're looking at a very large area and you're saying, oh my goodness, how are we going to handle this? So from initially when I started out, it was like there was a little bit of a trepidation of leaving the structure, the safety, if you will, of being a structure firefighter and going out into the wild and fighting a wildland fire.
It really can be intimidating when you see some of these fires. When you pull up, you're used to seeing room and contents, being able to read the smoke, being able to set your tactics and go one direction. A lot of these grass fires, wildland fires, you can't really set up your tactics ahead of time until you see wind conditions, the actual terrain. Is that true in your experience?
Absolutely. The same skills I would put forth that you hone and utilize in the structural world, you can translate directly to the wildland. For example, you mentioned reading smoke. Excellent skill that everyone needs to develop, but I can use that and process information from a distance through the windshield, nonetheless, as we're approaching in. I can tell a lot about what's burning, how aggressively, fuel type, where it's going to be moving, all those types of issues that should be coming to the forefront in a wildland response, which is similar but yet different in the structural world.
And you mentioned a very important thing, I think, where it's moving. You know, a structural fire, we look at it and we say, if we can hold it to the room of origin, great. If we can hold it to the building of origin, okay. But you've usually got that separation. In a wildland and grass fire, we may not have those man-made separations. We may have to actually create those, whether cutting line or use roads. Being able to anticipate which way the fire is moving is, I think, it's something that comes with experience. You know, we can sit in our S-130, S-190 classes and look at slides, and in an upcoming episode, we'll actually be looking at some pictures and talking about things like this. But what can a firefighter do as I'm getting off the engine and looking at a grass fire and looking at the smoke? How can I anticipate which way this fire is going to move? Should I be looking at fuel size? Should I be looking at the smoke? Should I be looking at terrain? What really should I be focusing on?
Well, you need to focus on three basic things. The fire is going to either be driven by the terrain, by the weather, and by the fuel, or a combination of all three. And so as you're watching, as Todd spoke of, which way is the smoke going? Which way is the wind blowing? What's the relative humidity for the day? And a difference from wildland experience is you have a variety of other outside influences that you have to focus on to be prepared to just give that initial first direction of where we're going to go. Whereas, hey, with a structure fire, it's a building. You're pretty much guaranteed there's going to be a set thermal layer in the room and such. In the wildland scenario, it's different. And also, in many cases, it may be your first time into that area. You're responding outside of your normal jurisdiction, and you may not know what the parameters, the boundaries are to, as we call, paint the box, so you know when incoming resources are are being assigned to you.
Paint the box. What does that mean?
We generally want to be able to take a north, south, east, west perspective of the fire and be able to say the fire is moving in this direction and is moving at this rate of spread. And so what I need to be thinking about is where am I going to put my resources that are going to be able to stop its advancement? And so you give them geographical locations. And again, from common knowledge, if you know there's a road, there's a ravine, there's a riverbed, that the fuel is either densely or sparsely populated where you can actually set up a defendable space, you would then have those resources go there as opposed to saying immediately we're going to jump right on the head of the fire and try and put it out at that stage. It may be better to say we don't want this fire to get beyond these locations.
Thinking ahead for the response that's coming behind us. When I first started off in rural New Mexico, there was no response coming behind us. It was me with a shovel, the guy on the ambulance with a cloud, and if we couldn't handle it, then we would have to call for mutual aid. It might be 30, 45 minutes before they get there. When you talk about painting the box, the term, as a firefighter that's maybe responding in my personal vehicle or alone on one of these response units, that sounds like something that I need to be passing along to my communications center, and they need to understand what I'm telling them. On scene, when you're directing these incidents, it seems like we have a unified language that we use. Do you find in your experience that the communication centers, the dispatchers that you're dealing with, understand this language and can pass along instructions appropriately? Or should we maybe start getting dispatchers some training in wildland terminology and response so they can anticipate our needs?
There's no exception to the rule that the accurate and very reliable incident size up, that big picture that you're processing and assimilating all that situational awareness types facts, all those things, and then boiling that down to that complete, concise picture that you paint for all responding units, dispatch included, that report on conditions. And a lot of places call it a size up as well. And, in that, I like to use report on conditions, but it is critical to nail that, and that gives everybody the idea coming in what to expect, what direction is the wind blowing. And for me, if I were to pass a couple of small, just most important tidbits to somebody who's new to the business or maybe interested in branching off, it would be stepping off that rig and really paying attention to where you are in relation to the main body of fire and which direction the wind. Because everybody should know or should become familiar with that concept that wind is what's pushing it. Wind is what's going to make it move. And yes, there's topography, there's fuel moisture, there's a lot of other influences, but wind will override all. And I see a lot of the incidents that those first choices of allocation of resources, line placement, hose line placement, aircraft utilization, all that being based around which way the fire is moving with the wind.
And a lot of that is going to be based on that first impression of that first report, correct? Until we can get a more experienced set of eyes in. Jeff on Twitter asks, what is a good way to estimate the size of a fire? An excellent question. When we arrive on scene of a structural fire, it's a 2-story, it's a type 5, it's set back. Those 3 things can tell other responding companies what to anticipate. When I arrive at a wildfire, I might estimate it by how many football fields I see, but how should I be relaying that information? By acre, by estimated size? What nomenclature should I be using?
Our agency, we always just came out with some basic footage. As you look at it, you say you've got a 20 by 50 moving at a slow, rapid, or moderate rate of spread. In which direction is it going? And then you try and use a compass rose to be able to say it's moving north to south, east to west. Or you may simply say, from an anchor point, it's moving from this road headed towards another landmark. That gives the other folks an idea of how fast it's going. Because for all of us, rate of spread is really subjective on what you know. Most people know a football field and they can relate to that, so I know I'm going in that regard.
Acre is a great way to keep it consistent. Just know that the human tendency is to overestimate, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because we build ourselves a safety margin. We tend to factor in almost double. We use, it's really an acre. We call it 2 to 5, but it's not a bad thing. I would just caution, knowing that. Don't take the number that you think and divide it by 2 and then report that. Just go with what you see. And you can always come up with an updated report. You can always say, hey, I'm revising it based on more accurate mapping.
Yeah, and you want to make sure, too, along with that you don't let your own personal position, your ego, or your influence get in there to where you say it's smaller than it really is. Some folks will say, well, I can handle this, it's only 3/4 of an acre, when in fact it actually is 2 acres, and it's at a rapid rate of spread, and you just simply say it's at a moderate rate of spread. Just acknowledge, as you say, here's what it's doing, and it's moving fast, and I'm going to need these resources.
Yeah, Todd, you mentioned earlier, when we're at night, when we're over terrain, we don't know. One of the rules that we have in wildland firefighting is never go on terrain you haven't seen during the light of day. That's mainly for crews, maybe cutting line deeper into the fire. I want to focus mainly on kind of that urban interface area where we may have to go out into an open field that we haven't seen before.
If that is the case, if you're responding to that incident in country not seen in daylight, it's one of those, I like to tie it back to the preseason, pre-plan. I mean, everybody's familiar with pre-planning structures and walking through structures in the daylight with the power on, where we can really see the footprint and the inner divisions, the compartmentalization of the structure itself. Translate that same skill to the wildland. Know your district, know the canyons, know the uneven terrain, know those problematic topography areas, see that in the daylight. Don't wait until it's the middle of the night, and be able to, in your mind's eye, recall that. And then obviously utilization and always working on map reading skills, which help us translate what we see or limited field of view in the dark with that topographic, and aiding in the amazing technological advances that we have at our disposal now in the apparatus. Google Earth, for example, and having topographic maps preloaded, and that ability to see all that remotely is a huge skill and advantage to overcome some of those risks.
And spread that knowledge throughout the department.
Yes. Don't keep it to yourself.
Yes. In Livermore Pleasanton, on the east side, we had the Altamont Pass, and on the west side, we have Castlewood, which is a very similar topography to what the Oakland Hills fire was. It's just a different aspect. The initial first-in engines are always up in those areas looking, kind of driving around, just as you say, Todd, getting that familiarization and that pre-planning. But it's the stations in between. The station out at the airport doesn't get out there to get out there that often. They need to have that information exchange besides getting the maps. Do those drive-arounds. Get upside the country, see what it's like, and be familiar with it. Not only because you're going to be the additional resources coming in, but if you're working an overtime shift or you're working a trade shift at that station now,
you need to know.
You need to know.
Not just getting out and seeing the topography, but finding out how to open that gate between the street and the area you're going to need to access. Who has the key? Is that Bureau of Land Management? Can we get a copy on the engine? Do the battalion chiefs have a copy? Who's got the key to that lock to get that gate open? That could be the #1 thing that turns that 4-acre fire into the 400-acre fire, because you can't get access to it. So definitely going out and knowing our first alarm areas, not just the buildings and the sprinkler systems, but the open areas, the public areas.
And every district's going to have that problem area that should obviously demand a lot of attention, but I see sometimes that stops there at the most problematic canyon or drainage or whatever it is, and people fail to look at the rest because all attention is focused there. It's that initial attack, but always looking forward to that bigger picture. Where is the next possible break?
And with equipment in the different areas, some stations will have different equipment during their wildland season. They will take equipment off that is normally carried on, and they'll put other equipment on. So again, familiarization too of what equipment do I have available to me on this piece of equipment. And if you're rolling into a station for a trade day or an overtime day, getting that familiarity. I'm going to wildland gear. I'm not going to be using my structural gear. Some people may have never heard of or have been familiar with using the McLeod or the Pulaskis, the brush hooks. That's the time, again, to brush up when you're just sitting in the station doing your training days as to how you're going to respond to that area.
A lot of the career departments are starting to cut back. A lot used to have 4 on the engine, now they're down to 3. That really takes an extra person on a tool away from us, or an extra person making that progressive hose lay, or being able to do a lot of these things. So we are tasked with doing more with less. Have you seen that in your personal experience have an impact on any fire in particular? Obviously, the more people we have at the scene, the easier it's going to be in many respects, but are staffing cuts having an effect on our ability to fight wildland fires?
I would say most definitely. Respective to CAL FIRE and their operations throughout the state, going from a 4.0 engine company staffing to a 3.0 engine company staffing where they have just 3 people on their rigs now, that puts a greater impact on their reliance from municipality agencies and county agencies to come in and supplement in the master mutual aid plan that we have in California. very, very big response turnout on a lot of our big campaign fires. With the economic downturn, there's always that question about, from the agency's perspective, are we going to be reimbursed? Under the Master Mutual Aid Plan, there's considerations for compensation to the agencies, and some agencies are going to be at that place where we can't afford the overtime to send our folks out for 10 to 14 days to supplement the state or other agencies that don't have the personnel. So
There's
I think you're
no
going to see
question that, having less bodies on the ground, less boots on the line is going to have an impact. As coincidence or fate or whatever you subscribe to would have it, the last 2 years where it seems, at least in California, that most of the financial impact has become the worse. The cuts have been the deepest in the last approximately 2 fiscal years. I don't think the true impact has been felt yet because we haven't had, as you said, campaign fire, that large event that has clearly demonstrated to both the public, policymakers, administration, the impacts of these cuts. We haven't felt them to the truest sense yet, and we'll see. I mean, that's just one of those things where we have to wait to have those realized.
Unfortunately, sometimes it seems like we need that reactionary response from our politicians after we've lost people's homes, after we've lost these large open spaces for people to be able to use. It's hard to justify our need until afterwards, and they see that we could have kept it smaller if we had had enough people. Going back real quick, I want to go ahead and close up our conversation today talking about the initial size up again. I think that's going to be one of the most important things. Would you both agree that, much like in an MCI or hazmat scenario, that in Wildland, the first 5 minutes could really set up the next 5 hours?
Absolutely.
If it's done properly.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask each of you, Jeff first, what are the 4 things that you would want to hear from your first arriving company in their size up of a wildland fire?
I want to know approximately how big the fire is.
So size.
So I need to know the size of the fire. I need to know the direction of travel that it's going.
Direction.
Okay. I need to know where that anchor point is going to be, where they're going to start the aggressive attack to hold this fire, and then what resources they're going to see that they're going to need. And you speak to the first 5 minutes. I'm looking at 30 minutes, 3 hours down the road, because in most wildland cases, it's going to get bigger. You're not going to get the initial jump on it that you would in a structure fire. So those are the points that I would be listening for and want my folks to put out immediately so the dispatcher and the other engines listening know where this fire is going to end up.
Todd, do you agree?
I would concur absolutely. Size is very important. I would like, for me, listening as another engine, for example, coming in, what fuels are burning. And again, we don't have to be absolutely precise and give it a verbal description that is belabored, but is it light, moderate, heavy? Right. Is it a rapid rate of spread? Is it a moderate rate of spread? I want to know what it's burning in, how big it is, how fast it's moving, and I want to know what is immediately threatened and what resources are necessary to handle that. And if you can tie that up into a report on conditions and give it that clear, concise, it's very obvious for not only the chiefs coming in, or if we don't have the luxury of having chiefs coming in, the other engines coming in, a real good mental picture of what's burning, how fast, etc.
Wonderful. And just real quick, you touched on an anchor point. And a lot of the folks that maybe don't get as much wildland training as some departments do, just real quick, what's a good anchor point?
You should start at whatever point you initially stop at. That's going to be your anchor point, and as you move forward, your position is to make sure the fire does not come back and get behind you. So everything that takes place moves from that location, and it moves out. All right, and that gives you then also the opportunity to be able to forecast where your outer perimeter is, going back to the paint the box comment I made earlier, to be able to set up for them is this is where we're starting from, and this is where we're going to. And if we can keep it here, and we know it's not going to come back on us, then we can advance and start our aggressive attack on the fire. If at that point in time, that engine company is going to start doing either a progressive hose lay or doing hand tools to go ahead and attack the fire.
And that's a decision that's obviously going to be situational dependent, whether we're going to use water or we're going to use tools, remove the fuel or remove the heat. Well, Jeff, Todd, thank you very much for taking time out of your day and joining us at the table. Hopefully, see you next time.
Look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Seat at the Table. If you have any questions or comments regarding wildland-urban interface or any other topics in the fire, EMS, or police communities, come join us at firstrespondersnetwork.tv.